evening, everyone. I'd like to thank everyone for coming out, braving the cold, and also for attending the presentation here at the Cumberland County Historical Society. As revealed in my introduction, I am especially a Civil War specialist. It holds a dear place in my heart, and my interest was really sparked when my grandparents purchased for me a Union kepi, which is the style hat worn by Civil War soldiers, when we visited a restaurant chain in Georgia. So
it was on sale.
Yeah, and as we were returning north from a trip to Florida, we decided to stop at this restaurant in Georgia, and we can only imagine the amount of ridicule that some in thought, some in spoken or unspoken word, that probably came from some of the vengeful Southerners as I passed through their native lands. But roughly at about the same age, I kind of had a minor fascination with railroads, which was partially spurred by the Thomas the Tank Engine TV show, which I watched on TV, and also some of my family's tradition, which included setting up model trains for Christmas, as well as a trip to the Strasburg Railroad, where we spent the night in a caboose at one of the famed hotels there, various cabooses that they have all lined up. Or shall I say, I kept my parents awake with my fascination for the cabooses all night, pretty much. But I decided to select this painting here for the opening slide. It's called Columbia Bridge Burning by Bradley Schmel, to fill the background of this slide because it exemplifies one of the most desperate and least desirable results of the skirmishing between Union and Confederate forces during the Gettysburg Campaign. The burning of central Pennsylvania's very own Wrightsville-Columbia Bridge by Union militia on Sunday, June 28, 1863, to prevent the Confederate forces from making any further eastward movement in their campaign through Pennsylvania. Subsequent movements eastward through this corridor of Pennsylvania Dutch country by Confederate forces could have threatened some of the most fertile farmland in the nation at the time. Additionally, the failure to roll back the Confederate advance could have resulted in threats to Philadelphia's countryside. The storied destruction of Wrightsville-Columbia acknowledges the central role that infrastructure supporting modes of transportation like the railroad played in the war. At the time, Wrightsville-Columbia was considered the longest covered bridge in the world. And in 1840, the greatest improvements were made to the bridge. For $10,000, a bi-level towpath was put on the southern side of the bridge to connect the canal on the eastern river bank running from Harrisburg to Columbia. And that canal was the Susquehanna and Tidewater Canal, which ran 45 miles south to the Chesapeake Bay. Additionally, railroad tracks allowed mules to pull train engines and rail cars from one bank to the other. The bridge was literally a connecting link between the Philadelphia and Columbia Railroad and the Northern Central Railroad, and just 2 years prior to the bridge's burning, the Pennsylvania Railroad acquired controlling interest of the Northern Central rolling stock, making the emerging conglomerate a competitive rival of the Baltimore and Ohio, the famed east-west line that ran south of the Mason-Dixon line. The Wrightsville-Columbia saga is but one aspect of Pennsylvania's Civil War and rail history that I'll be focusing on more thoroughly at a later point in this presentation. That brings me to tonight's objectives for the presentation. My first objective is to discuss how Confederate military strategists targeted specific northern railroads and rail infrastructure during the key campaigns and invasions of the North during the Civil War. The second objective, which is revealed and addressed in the second half of this presentation, and those slides have black backgrounds to them, whereas the first half has white backgrounds to them, is to use a comparative lens with period photography, to describe how Union forces used and assaulted Southern railroads during the Civil War. The photographs of the Southern Railroad infrastructure are the best artifacts which illustrate the harsh realities of modern warfare that we can call the Civil War. Additionally, the photography of the engineering marvels that come out of this period are a testament to the ingenuity of the people in their times. I'd like to provide a little further context here as to the status of railroads in the United States in the years leading up to the start of the Civil War. Between 1820 and 1850, there were 9,022 miles of track laid and utilized in the United States. Most of the railroads were local eastern and midwestern ventures, though some had developed as far west as Texas and California. A total of $372 million was spent by investors on railroads by the year 1850, and in just 10 years, by 1860, the amount skyrocketed to $1.15 billion. It should also be noted that by 1860, the amount of track in use more than tripled to 30,000 miles, or over 30,000 miles, in operation in the United States. 9,000 miles of which would be claimed by the Confederacy, which would emerge especially in early 1861. And by mid-1850s, the United States had laid as much track mileage as the rest of the world, and it only had 5% of the world's population. So that 1850s to 1860 period marked a massive boom in the use and dependency of railroads for transporting goods, material, personnel, all of that. I'm going to move to my next slide here. Okay, so this slide features a map that I cropped to kind of show a more narrower focus for my presentation. It was printed in 1861 and shows a section of the country through which I'll be focusing on tonight. The first half of the presentation includes efforts to seize and destroy rail infrastructure north of the Pennsylvania-Maryland border, the Mason-Dixon line, with just a few connections made to the war in Maryland as it occurred. The second half includes comparisons in relation to the railroads south of the Mason-Dixon line in Maryland, Virginia, the Eastern Theater of the war, with additional comparisons being made to Georgia and Tennessee, or areas that were fought over by the Western Theater armies. With regards to the geographic constraints of central Pennsylvania railroads, I'm predominantly focusing on those lines between Reading, Pennsylvania, which you can see, of course, east of Harrisburg on the Lebanon Valley line, and Altoona, Pennsylvania in the west, which is along the Pennsylvania Central Railroad line, or the Pennsylvania Railroad as it's best known by railroad historians today, as well as several points south using the Pennsylvania Railroad as the northern border, which I'll be addressing the Cumberland Valley Railroad, the Northern Central Railway, and of course the Franklin Railroad as well. So I, especially being employed in Harrisburg, have a keen interest in the railroads that fed into the capital city for a variety of reasons. Lebanon Valley Railroad, of course, was the railroad used by my ancestors who served in the Civil War as they were transported west into Harrisburg to receive their training at Camp Curtin. But these railroads that converged in Harrisburg all contributed to why Harrisburg is sometimes referred to as a Civil War city. It was a period where there was a considerable amount of movement and events going on in the city with the training of Union forces, but also with the supplying and equipage of them as well. So to point out the railroads that converged in Harrisburg, you have, starting on the southeast, going into Harrisburg, where it meets the Pennsylvania Central Railroad, is the Columbia branch, which connected Columbia, Pennsylvania, to the Pennsylvania Railroad in the southern part of Harrisburg's lines eastward. You also have the Pennsylvania Railroad, or the Pennsylvania Central Railroad, connecting Philadelphia to Pittsburgh in the grand scheme of things. But that railroad would go up along the east branch, or the east bank of the Susquehanna River into Harrisburg, and then proceed north, cross a railroad bridge further up the Susquehanna. That's, you can see the pylons for it today, but eventually would become the Marysville Bridge in that area there. And then proceed out into places further north and then west. And then you also have the Lebanon Valley Branch, which I mentioned before, coming in from the east. That branch would connect Harrisburg to Reading, and then eventually Reading, that rail line would continue to go east into Philadelphia. And then you have the Schuylkill and Susquehanna Railroad branch, which would connect the key waterway and canal systems with the Pennsylvania and coal regions. So that would kind of run south of Halifax to where it meets the Susquehanna River, and then run eastward through into Schuylkill County. And then, of course, of most interest probably to you people is the branch coming out of Harrisburg, going west through Carlisle, the Cumberland Valley Railroad, which would connect Harrisburg to Chambersburg, and then going south of Chambersburg to Hagerstown, Maryland, and be known as the Franklin Railroad. So it's basically a continuous line that was a gateway to the south. So all these lines, very essential for moving troop personnel, and also essential for moving supplies as well during the war. So when it comes to the strategic use of railroads in the Civil War, there's a couple key terms that I had already mentioned, but I'll just review them. First, you have transportation and logistics. So the moving of troops and supplies and wounded soldiers over great distance was a key use for railroads during the Civil War. You also have the defense of officers and the moving headquarters, and also the movement of soldiers in armored rail cars and defensive structures, which is depicted by that picture in the middle of an armored car on the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. So that was something that was not necessarily practiced as heavily on the railroads around here, but on some of the embattled railroads of the South, where you had some serious situations where forces engaged with the railroads, those vehicles were very essential. You also have privately owned rail lines that could be commandeered by the military and directed by military and government officials to achieve their strategic goals. So what that refers to is the use of these rail lines by the War Department, or under the direction of the executive branch, to meet strategic goals and move troops as well. My next slide explains how efforts to target railroads in warfare and some of the tactics used and the strategic implications of those tactics could be felt far and wide. So first, you can destroy track or rolling stock by destroying locomotives and cars as well. And you can destroy supporting infrastructure like bridges and tunnels. That's another another tactic that could be used. So, for one, targeting the tracks could involve heating the tracks in the center, wrapping them around a tree or a telegraph pole, the famous Sherman neckties as practiced in the South. Targeting the rolling stock or the locomotives and cars could include destroying it all, lighting on fire. If it's on the rails itself, the easiest way to destroy a train during the Civil War would have been to shoot a cannonball simply through the boiler of the train. And then you also have the destruction of infrastructure, bridges and tunnels, which, as I'll explain a little later, could have occurred in some rather simple ways, but often occurred in haste, a lot of times by guerrilla forces, cavalry, etc., as they moved through a particular area. So some of the premonitions of an active and a robust rail war that occurred simultaneously with the Civil War can be tied back to some of the secretive, violent, and riotous activities that occurred in Baltimore prior to Abraham Lincoln's assumption of the presidency in March of 1861. Those events run concurrent with the federal response to the firing on Fort Sumter in April and the emergency defense of Washington, D.C., as well as efforts to bolster the presence of Union troops around Baltimore and D.C. in later points of 1861. There have recently been numerous volumes written by students of the Civil War era about the Baltimore plot. The February 1861 attempt to assassinate and/or capture President-elect Abraham Lincoln as he passed through Baltimore en route to assume the presidency in D.C. Since Lincoln's mode of transportation to the nation's capital was by rail, and since Baltimore's laws regarding the forbidding of passage of engines through the city limits, there was an increased chance of Lincoln being exposed to unsupportive and unscrupulous characters. And it is easy to see why railroad executives would have invested stake in the security of the president-elect. The circumstances explain why Samuel M. Felton, the president of the Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore Railroad, would seek the services of Allen Pinkerton and his operatives to provide the security for the president-elect. Likewise, the suspected plot had a direct impact on the status and usage of the Northern Central Railway and other routes feeding into Maryland, such as the Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore, and the Baltimore and Ohio. Lincoln's journey into Baltimore was via the Northern Central, a railroad which Central Pennsylvania's Cameron family had invested so much stake in, and Cameron, being an early political rival of Lincoln during the 1860 presidential election, would serve as a powerful man that Lincoln would need to get on his side, especially when it came to communicating with the railroad directors in Pennsylvania. Since the Baltimore plot was foiled, and since Lincoln passed safely to Washington, this thrilling moment remains just a footnote in our nation's history. And it's overshadowed by Fort Sumter. It's overshadowed by the agitation caused by when the war outbroke in April of 1861. And the February 1861 plot was not the last time that Baltimore would attract the attention of rail executives within the year. The impending crisis after the firing on Sumter positioned the president and the capital in harm's way once more. Passage through Baltimore en route to Washington was the most direct way for troops to reach the capital, and the riotous mob, as depicted in this illustration, would certainly show how Union troops, like those of the 6th Massachusetts, the unit being attacked, or the Pennsylvania First Defenders, how dangerous this city and its pro-Southern peoples were. The passage of loyal troops through Baltimore became a nightmare for government and rail executives in mid-April of 1861. These troops were forced to face the mob, but the real crisis for the public officials lay in determining the viability of railroads in Baltimore for connecting the city to Washington, D.C. And particularly after this mob, on April 19, 1861, there was an order given to the Maryland State Militia that and a direction to disable the railroad bridges and telegraph lines running north from the city on the day after the riot. Following the April riots, peace would slowly return to Baltimore. However, the tension by Southern loyalties within the city's inhabitants would remain throughout the war. Baltimore's military defenses remained occupied by Union troops, and some of the cities and state of Maryland's most notable citizens were imprisoned in Fort McHenry. When the opportunity knocked for the Confederate commander Robert E. Lee to launch his September 1862 invasion of Maryland, it seems that an assault into the free, pro-Southern populace of Baltimore would make perfect sense. He could gain support of those individuals. He could recruit individuals into the Army. However, Lee did exactly not that. Lee would seek supplies, and he would seek fresh troops for a severely outnumbered army as he launched the invasion into a largely pro-Union central Maryland through the state's panhandle. So as determined by Civil War historians, many of which, including Stephen Sears, David Etcher, Robert E. Lee's goal of the Maryland campaign was to reach the northern state of Maryland, and possibly Pennsylvania, although it's not entirely clear if that was a long-term goal, and accomplish a secondary goal of cutting off the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad that supplied Washington, D.C. His movements would threaten Washington and Baltimore as to, quote, annoy and harass the enemy. This map shows Confederate and Union maneuvers during the Maryland campaign between September 3rd and 20th, the end of the campaign in 1862, and the precarious position of the Baltimore and Ohio, or B&O line, directly in the midst of the Army of Northern Virginia and Army of the Potomac's movements. So the B&O line basically parallels the Potomac River, and you can see Northern troops moving north of those lines, Southern troops moving south of that rail line, engaging right in the middle. So it was a difficult place for that rail line to be, and there's been numerous researchers who have focused on the B&O rail line during the Civil War as well. This map also shows the movement of Confederate troops on the upper side of the map towards Hagerstown from Boonesboro, Maryland. And here in Hagerstown, those troops would have provided a direct threat to the end, or the final point of the Cumberland Valley Line, or the Franklin Railroad, as it's often called as well. But besides the tracks, there was not much there for the Confederates to threaten. At 2 a.m. on September 7th, 1862, the Cumberland Valley removed the rolling stock and locomotives from Hagerstown and sent them north into Chambersburg in anticipation of further Confederate movements northward. On September 11th, 1862, General Robert Toombs' Georgia Brigade entered Hagerstown. In response, the governor of Pennsylvania, Andrew Curtin, issued a direct call for 50,000 men to defend Pennsylvania, with General Order Number 36. Rail movements of these troops were placed in direction of Thomas A. Scott, the former Assistant Secretary of War who served with Simon Cameron, and the Pennsylvania Railroad executive who he'd of course served as president of that railroad after the Civil War. Scott was to ensure that Pennsylvania's railroads gave priority to troop transportation over all other forms of transportation and needs of the railroad. The subsequent mobilization of the Pennsylvania Militia of 1862 was largely done with the goal of protecting the rail lines linking Washington and Harrisburg. In command of this militia force was General John F. Reynolds of Lancaster. From September 14th to 16th of 1862, the militia force moved towards Chambersburg using the Cumberland Valley Railroad. However, the railroad had an inadequate capacity to transport troops in such a short time frame. Thus, crews, engines, and rolling stock were put on loan from the Pennsylvania Railroad to accomplish the goal of transporting and positioning the Union forces that would defend the Pennsylvania border from an invasion that would never come. What was achieved by the way of the Cumberland Valley Railroad and other central Pennsylvania rail lines in mid-September of 1862 was the logistical triumph of getting artillery and small arms ammunition from points east of Harrisburg, the capital city, Chambersburg, and Hagerstown, all up to General McClellan's forces in the field. The last two slides on the Baltimore crisis and the Maryland campaign illustrate threats from a distance on central Pennsylvania's key rail lines, including the Cumberland Valley and Northern Central. Next 8 slides will focus on how subsequent threats to these lines became very real to the rail lines' home territories. So this slide focuses on Jeb Stuart's Chambersburg raid across the Cumberland Valley, and he would also cross the Cumberland Valley Railroad in Chambersburg as well. This was the first real threat to the Cumberland Valley in Pennsylvania, and it came between October 10th and 12th, 1862, when Stuart's cavalry was completing the northern arc of its second ride around McClellan. He was using 1,800 cavalry soldiers and 4 pieces of light artillery, and he raided across the Mason-Dixon line into Pennsylvania and launched some damage against Mercersburg, Chambersburg, and then Cashtown, which is northwest of Gettysburg, following his return back into Maryland. Stuart's primary goal of this raid was to gather fresh mounts for his cavalry forces and to capture civilians, which he would exchange with Confederates. However, he also destroyed rail equipment, buildings, and track on the Cumberland Valley line near Chambersburg. One of Lee's goals for Stuart was to target and destroy the rail bridge over the Connecticut Creek, just 5 miles north of Chambersburg. Given false information that this bridge was made out of iron by locals, and a cold rain prevented Stuart's patrol, which was led by Captain Thomas Whitehead, from reaching or carrying out the bridge's destruction. Whitehead simply did not have the supplies to blow up the bridge, and they were expecting it to be harder to destroy than it turned out to be. Pennsylvania's damage from Stuart's raid totaled more than $200,000, with the Cumberland Valley Railroad claiming $80,000 in damages. Those damages included a torched car house, a torched engine house, water and wood facilities, and a multi-story frame office which included the headquarters for the railroad. The wooden bridge over the Connecticut survived only to be destroyed the next year during the Gettysburg campaign. So that takes me to the Gettysburg campaign, and what I did was I included a similar map that shows the movements for the entire campaign. This map shows the course of direction taken by the Union Army of the Potomac and the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia during the campaign as they moved into Maryland and south central Pennsylvania. It is easy to determine that the road and rail routes were essential in assisting the Confederate forces in identifying key targets and objectives other than just Meade's army, as often historians determine. Though Confederate forces reached the Susquehanna Valley in the last weeks of June, opportunities and time existed for Lee's advance elements to assault the rail infrastructure of the Cumberland Valley and the Northern Central Railway, laying further to the east. The next three slides show some of the rail bridges that were destroyed by Lee's grand raid into Pennsylvania in June of 1863. First of these slides is on the destruction of the Scotland Bridge on June 16, 1863. With Confederate Brigadier General Albert Jenkins leading the advanced cavalry elements of the Army of Northern Virginia, 2nd Corps into Pennsylvania, in the Cumberland Valley on Monday, June 15, 1863, it appeared that the grand raid would resemble Stuart's raid the previous fall. So you had them using basically the same routes with the mountains as their screen on their east, and then leading up or following the valley up into Pennsylvania contributed to them coming to the same towns and same areas that were under attack. As a precaution, Judge Frederick Watts, the Cumberland Valley Railroad president, would suspend all rail traffic towards Hagerstown, and he ordered the railroad's rolling stock and locomotives to return northward, and leaving the rails themselves vulnerable. Jenkins almost immediately went to work with his raiding activities targeting the Franklin Railroad line south of Chambersburg and the Cumberland Valley line as well. His primary goal was to cut Carlisle and Harrisburg off from Chambersburg, and the Cumberland Valley Railroad's wooden bridge at Scotland stood in the way. For the Scotland Bridge, reconstruction of this piece of infrastructure would begin just 3 days after its burning on the 16th. Another bridge that was targeted on the Northern Central line was at Hanover Junction, and this picture is not the bridge that was destroyed, but was the bridge that was rebuilt. Just 11 days later, on June 27, 1863, the Northern Central Railroad Bridge at Hanover Junction met a similar fate at the hands of Confederate cavalry led by Lieutenant Colonel Elijah White. White's troopers burned the turntable and rolling stock at Hanover Junction in York County, and then the covered bridge over the Codorus Creek before ripping down the telegraph lines. General Herman Haupt reported that the Confederate forces at the end of the Gettysburg campaign had destroyed a total of 19 bridges on the Northern Central Railway between Hanover Junction and Harrisburg during the engagements. Prior to his construction corps being returned to Virginia to secure the Orange and Alexandria and the Manassas Gap railroads in mid-July 1863. The most memorable bridge to be destroyed during the Gettysburg campaign was, of course, Wrightsville, Columbia, and that was not even set on fire by the Confederate forces that threatened the banks of the Susquehanna between York and Lancaster counties. Here's the depiction of the inferno from Harper's Weekly magazine. So pages 1 to 4 of Colonel Jacob Frick's report on the defense and burning of the Wrightsville-Columbia Bridge are seen here. And these pages are in the collection of the National Civil War Museum, but the transcription for this document is found in the official records of the War of the Rebellion. To capture the circumstances surrounding the burning of this bridge, I'll turn to his report, and I'll give you a little bit of background about Frick as well. Jacob Frick was a resident of Pottsville in Schuylkill County, and he commanded the 27th Pennsylvania Militia at the time of the burning of the bridge. And he writes Captain Robert Lee Roy, the Assistant Adjutant General of the Department of the Susquehanna, the following. Frick would write, "Captain, I have the honor to report that in compliance with General Order Number 14 from the Department of Susquehanna, I left Harrisburg on the morning of the 24th and arrived here on the afternoon of the same day, and immediately sent 4 companies in command of Lieutenant Colonel Green over the river. On the morning of the 25th, I sent 4 more companies to that officer with instructions to take up position near the York Turnpike, about a half a mile from Wrightsville. Hearing on the afternoon of the 27th that the enemy were in the vicinity of York, I ordered my 2 remaining companies to report to Lieutenant Colonel Green that we might be prepared to resist any sudden attempt by the enemy to get possession of the bridge at that point. Late in the evening of the same day, I crossed the river, assumed command, and disposed of my force for defense. During the night, our force was increased by 4 companies from Columbia, 3 white, 1 colored, numbering 175 men. Very early next morning, having obtained entrenching tools from the citizens of Columbia and the Pennsylvania Railroad Company, my own men, and the Negro Company, the other 3 companies from Columbia having left for home, dug rifle pits on either side of the turnpike. During the morning, a detachment of convalescent soldiers from York and the Patapsco Guard, and all about 250 men, joined me, and they were posted on the left of the town, protecting the left flank of my position. They were placed under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Green. We were joined by scattered fragments of the 20th Regiment, Pennsylvania Volunteer Militia, under Lieutenant Colonel Sickles during the morning, which I posted on the right of the town as a protection of the right flank. The work of entrenching was continued until the approach and attack of the enemy about 5:30 p.m. And while work was in progress, I selected, with the assistance of Major Haller, aide-de-camp to the commanding general, several points at which post my limited number of men. The main body of the enemy, about 2,500 strong, composed of cavalry, artillery, and infantry, took up their position about 6 p.m. on the turnpike to our immediate front, and within 3/4 of a mile of our rifle pits. A force of cavalry and infantry moved down the railroad on our left and attacked our skirmishers, who after replying to their fire for a short time, retired to the main body, which kept up a steady fire and held the enemy in check until they received orders to retire to the bridge. The rebels succeeded in getting a battery in position on elevated ground on our right in a section of our immediate front. These guns were used most vigorously against my command, occupying the rifle pits. In the meantime, they sent a column of infantry under the cover of a high hill on our right, within a few hundred yards of the river. None but their skirmishers approached within range of the guns, and the men occupied the rifle pits, these being in a green field and obscured from our view. Excepting when they would rise to fire, which was difficult to do much harm to dislodge them. They depended exclusively upon artillery to drive us from our position. Having no artillery ourselves on the side of the river which to reply, and after retaining our position for about 1¼ hours, and discovering our remaining longer would enable the enemy to reach the river on both of my flanks, which I was unable to prevent because of a small number of men under my command, and thus because a great position of the bridge cut off our retreat and secured a crossing of the Susquehanna, which I was instructed to prevent. I retired in good order and crossed the bridge to the Lancaster side. Before the enemy had left York for the river, I made a supposed very necessary arrangement to blow up one span of the Columbia Bridge. When they got within sight, the gentleman charged with the expedition of that work repaired promptly to the bridge, and with the execution of that work, commenced installing off the arches and heavy timbers, prepared to blow it up with powder. After the abundance of time was allowed, and after I supposed every man of my command over the river, when the enemy had entered the town with his artillery and reached the barricade to the bridgehead. I gave the order to light the fuse. The explosion took place, but to our regret, in blowing up the bridge, failed. It was then that I felt it my duty to prevent the enemy from crossing the river and marching on to Harrisburg in the rear, destroying his route, railroads and bridges, to order the bridge to be set on fire. The bridge was completely destroyed through a vigorous attempt and made to save the part by the soldiers. I was materially assisted in my operations by Captain Strickler, who was in charge of a small force of cavalry acting as scouts. I felt indebted to him for much reliable information in the movements of the force and the enemy. So that kind of explains the context behind the efforts to defend the bridge and then eventually burn and destroy the bridge. On the retreat from Gettysburg, following the battle, July 1st to 3rd, 1863, you have also the movement of Confederate troops to the north as they evacuated the town and as they evacuated Gettysburg, using the Cumberland Valley Railroad as a directive path to lead them back into Maryland and then eventually back into Virginia. From this map, you can see the wagon train of Confederate wounded and supplies parallel the Cumberland Valley Railroad and their line of retreats. Wounded troops over their long-term period of care needed service of hospitals in cities like Harrisburg, Frederick, Baltimore, and Philadelphia. And rail transports made the task of removing the wounded less painful than the use of wagon ambulances, which would happen in these cases to be the need for using rail lines to remove the disabled. The Union military railroad official who proved himself to be the genius in reopening the disabled and attacked rail lines was General Herman Haupt. Haupt, unfortunately, was ordered to return to Alexandria, Virginia on July 14, 1863 with his men, equipment, and supplies. So that left much of the work to be done by Pennsylvanians themselves in repairing the lines. So that brings me to my efforts to compare the rail operations to other theaters of the Civil War. And the next slides use the historic photographs to illustrate railroads and other theaters of the war, as well as efforts to target these railroads, which became alternative soft targets for the purpose of delivering destructive warfare and for preventing the movement of enemy troops and munitions. It is very visible in these photographs the degree to which the military management of these rail lines contributed to the adaptations of rail technology and engineering feats in securing rail infrastructure. Prolonged warfare over a great period of time, in my mind, is the key factor which caused the rail warfare that ran concurrently with the Civil War to take the form that it did. So to begin with, I'd like to turn to the Western Theater, where engines, rolling stock, and flat cars heavily contributed to the movement of Union troops out of captured cities like Nashville. Though the rails may have contributed to Rosecrans getting cut off and surrounded at Chattanooga, the rails also contributed to him getting bailed out of Chattanooga. The kind of equipment also contributed to the movement of men and supplies, particularly after the Gettysburg campaign. Once the war returned to Virginia in mid-July 1863, both Confederate and Union forces transferred forces to the Western Theater via rail service. 12,000 Confederates in James Longstreet's 1st Corps, of course without Pickett's division, which was severely damaged in its charge at Gettysburg, transferred to the Georgia-Tennessee border just in time to fight the Battle of Chickamauga in September 1863. Confederate forces traveled via the Memphis and Charleston line. Additionally, the Union 11th and 12th Corps transferred to this theater of war from Washington, D.C. to assist in opening up Chattanooga and the gateway through northwest Georgia. Late in 1864, the Overland Campaign and leading into the Petersburg Campaign saw Ulysses S. Grant learning lessons of command, supply, and logistics from earlier campaigns and actions when he established a rather permanent headquarters in City Point in Prince George County, Virginia. 2 huge military installations were built here to keep his troops and supplies well maintained. These photographs illustrate the sophisticated nature of Grant's supply network at City Point. Through 1862 and 1863, the campaigns in Maryland and Pennsylvania were in many ways rapidly waged and fought, employing often raid or hit-and-run style tactics. Images of the rail war in Tennessee and Virginia reveal more stagnation of forces and the utilization of hard-hitting power of rail artillery. Defensive features like those seen on the rail bridge across the Cumberland River at Nashville are a testament of the need to protect vital rail networks. Likewise, rail artillery had a vital place in the campaigns in eastern Virginia, especially since McClellan was on the peninsula in the spring of 1862. The rail battery pictured at right is just one example of what was used late in the war during the Petersburg Campaign. Through it all, track destruction remained a key feature of rail warfare strategy, and Sherman's Union forces and their fiery thrust through Atlanta and the march to the sea proved they had a keen knack for destroying track. This photo of Sherman's troops in Atlanta captures the general's comprehension that rail transport, when utilized by Confederates, could pose a serious military advance and thus further prolong the war. Rail historian George Abdel notes the following about Sherman's march to the sea in November of 1864. He ordered the Western and Atlantic Railroad torn up to protect his rear, and the track of Atlanta to the Uintah River, 46 miles, was destroyed. In addition, 16 miles of track was taken up between Resaca and Dalton, Georgia, and the rails were moved to Chattanooga. Major General Thomas later ordered the state road repaired, and the construction corps laid 66 miles of track and repaired an additional 36 miles. Rebuilding many destroyed bridges, the work was accomplished between May 10th and July 4th, 1865. So here you have a classic case where the railroads were destroyed. They'd later be rebuilt for use into the future. So doesn't this story of this aspect of the rail war in the Deep South during a much later part of the war strikingly resemble the Confederate activities in Pennsylvania on a much larger scale? That's a question that I'll leave you to answer in your own research. The tracks were not the only rail infrastructure that needed repair. Remnants of rolling stock were often left in ruin to a degree in the Deep South in Richmond and Petersburg, which overshadowed what the Confederates accomplished in the North. At this late stage in the war, desperation on the part of an overwhelmed Confederate forces defended the rail infrastructure and rolling stock, contributed these objects to their own destruction at the hands of their own defenders. So this image shows the ammunition train that was destroyed by the Confederates under John Bell Hood as he left Atlanta, and as Sherman continued eastward on the march, Hood, of course, moved northwestward up towards Tennessee. So, of course, the questions you must ask, or to put yourself in the position of these soldiers at this time, would be, why would you want the enemy to use rails, rail cars, engines, and infrastructure that you had used to support yourself to their advantage while they launched their own campaigns? And such was the classic conundrum felt by Confederate Field Commander John Bell Hood. He, of course, chose to set fire to his own equipage. The destruction of railroad bridges was a feature of rail rail warfare employed elsewhere, and that was strikingly similar to the campaigns in Pennsylvania and Maryland. Though Herman Haupt was appointed the chief of the U.S. Military Railroad Bureau by Edwin Stanton, and thus given the task of constructing and operating military railroads, he also contributed his own ingenuity to creating a device to demolish the wooden truss bridge. The Haupt torpedo, which is seen at left, it could be inserted into holes in a truss bridge for a more effective means of destruction. And there you can see the bridge at right, which crosses the Tennessee River at Bridgeport, Tennessee, a very vital link to the to Georgia that would have been used by the 11th and 12th Corps, of course, transferring into that theater of the war, having destruction on both ends of the bridge. That brings me to my final slide, the reconstruction of the railroad. The fallout from all the destructive style warfare, which had an immediate goal of crippling the enemy transport, as well as easing the way the war was waged, demonstrates that the long shadow of rebuilding enemy long shadow of this type of warfare had an impact on future rail war efforts. Haupt's construction corps, made largely by African-American work crews, could bring destroyed track and rail bridges, often demolished by mounted rebel guerrillas, back into commission for use by federal forces during the war. Additionally, the Sherman necktie could be straightened with the use of this device, the jack screw. This work was arduous and backbreaking, but it was a necessary feat that the reconstruction of the Union and its rail networks depended on to bring the nation forward into the future. Thank you.
Thank you.